To the world, the name Woodward was the definition of American royalty. Forged in the granite vaults of the Hanover Bank and crowned at the legendary Bel Air stud, the family rose from the dust of industry to the absolute peak of power. They were the untouchable symbols of old money, living in a fortress of gold where racehorses were treated better than humans. They believed they owned everything, including the law. But the empire didn't fall to a market crash. It was destroyed by a shotgun blast in a master bedroom. In 1955, the dynasty's prince, William Woodward Jr., was executed by his own wife, Ann Woodward, a former showgirl who clawed her way into their world. She blew his face off with a hunting shotgun and claimed she mistook him for a prowler. It was a lie that the matriarch, Elsie Woodward, coldly covered up to save the bank's reputation. But the truth found a different executioner, Truman Capote. When the famous writer exposed Anne as a cold-blooded killer in his scandalous book, the showgirl had only one exit left, a cyanide pill swallowed moments before her secrets hit the shelves. The Woodward dynasty had spent a century building a legacy, only to see it end in a pool of blood and a vial of poison. The ruthless banker, William Woodward Saar, and the blood money. The Woodward fortune stands as a monolithic testament to the terrifying efficiency of American capitalism. Its foundation was laid within the granite vaults of the Hanover National Bank, an institution that operated less like a community lender and more like a financial guillotine. It was a banker's bank, a wholesale engine of capital that held the debt of nations and the fate of industries. William Woodward Sr. was often whispered about in trade exchanges as the Cotton Baron, a title stemming from the bank's stranglehold on the crop that clothed the world. He extracted profit at every stage, from the plantation to the textile mill, accruing wealth from the labor of millions who would never know his name. To William Sr., commodities, whether cotton or human lives, were merely abstract figures on a ledger, lines of ink that either balanced or did not. The Hanover National Bank wasn't just a place for deposits. It was a fortress where William Sr. played God with the American economy. He didn't just trade cotton, he owned the very air the workers breathed. From the sweat-soaked fields of the South to the soot-stained mills of the North, every cent of the Woodward fortune was rinsed in the labor of a nameless class. He was a man who could bankrupt a city over a morning cigar and feel nothing. This wasn't business. It was a financial colonization of the American dream. He built a world where the only language spoken was the cold click of a vault door, ensuring that by the time his son was born, the Woodwards didn't just have money. They had the power to determine who lived and who died among those beneath them. The peak of greed, where horses outranked men. This immense wealth, born from cold logic, generated a psychological distortion that found its most grotesque physical manifestation in the Bel Air stud in Maryland. This estate was more than a farm. It was a kingdom where horses were citizens and humans were serfs. While America starved during the Great Depression, William Woodward Sr. poured millions into equine genetics, achieving a feat never matched in history, breeding the only father and son pair to both win the Triple Crown, Gallant Fox in 1930 and Omaha in 1935. The stables were cathedrals of mahogany and brass. The injustice was stark. In the Woodward universe, a horse with a cracked hoof received better medical care than a coal miner with a crushed lung. The atmosphere at Bel Air was defined by a chilling hypocrisy. The family projected an image of sterilized old money perfection, looking down on the moral looseness of the lower classes. Yet, behind the high hedges of their estate, William Sr. hid a complex web of social secrets, allegedly indulging in affairs with younger women that starkly contradicted the puritanical image he demanded from his family. They valued pedigree above character. They obsessed over good stock and bad blood, viewing the world through the lens of a breeder. To William Sr., his horses were investments that yielded glory. His son Billy was merely a liability that required management. This obsession with the sport of kings was not a hobby. It was a deliberate performance of aristocracy. By mimicking the landed gentry of England, the Woodwards attempted to wash the smell of commerce off their hands. They wanted to be seen as lords of the manor, not mere bankers. Yet, the obsession with pure blood created a closed, toxic loop. The Bel Air stud became a gilded cage where the air was stagnant. By isolating themselves with their animals and their servants, they lost touch with the raw, dangerous reality of the human world. They believed their wealth formed an impenetrable force field against tragedy. Dark speculation has long surrounded the emotional climate of the estate. Visitors frequently reported a silence that hung over the dinner table, a tension that was only broken by discussions about stud fees and race results. The family lived in a bubble of supreme entitlement, unaware that by treating the world with such disdain, they were inviting a reckoning. They were breeding horses for speed, but they were breeding their own family for disaster. The Bel Air stud was a symbol of their triumph, but it was also the incubator of their doom. A place where the value of a life was determined solely by its ability to win a race, and where those who failed to perform were quietly, ruthlessly discarded. This absolute financial power granted William Sr. a social status in New York that bordered on the divine. He was the ultimate gatekeeper. As the driving force behind the Jockey Club, the governing body of American horse racing, he wielded the power to determine who was socially acceptable and who was trash. The Jockey Club was not merely a sporting organization. It was the high court of the American aristocracy, a tribunal that decided which families were allowed to breed, race, and mingle. Woodward ruled this domain with an iron fist wrapped in a kid glove. He protected the purity of the club with the same fanaticism he applied to his stables, ensuring that the wrong sort of people, the new money, the flashy, the ethnic, were kept outside the gates. There is a sickening, disgusting hypocrisy in this guardianship. A man whose fortune was built on the ruthless exploitation of commerce spent his life pretending that trade was beneath him, constructing a sterilized bubble where he could play the role of the landed nobleman. But while he was busy guarding the gates of high society, the walls of his own home were beginning to crumble, turning his gilded manor into a private torture chamber for his only heir. The cursed heir, how Billy Woodward was broken by his father. The rumor engine of New York society has long sustained a dark mythology regarding William's personality. Servants and junior associates described a man who had surgically removed his own capacity for warmth. He was a creature of routine and ritual, moving through his townhouses and estates with the cold precision of a clock mechanism. He despised weakness in all its forms, viewing it as a moral failing rather than a human condition. This pathological coldness found its most tragic target in his only son and heir, William Billy Woodward Jr. The war between William Sr. and Billy serves as the psychological blast zone of the entire saga. William Sr. did not want a son, he wanted a clone. He desired a successor who possessed his steel spine, his financial acumen, and his ruthless judgment. Instead, biology gave him Billy, a tall, handsome, but fundamentally soft young man who preferred the company of women and the ease of a trust fund to the brutal warfare of the bank. The father looked at the son and saw a bad investment. He saw a liability. Witnesses from the era recount scenes of excruciating psychological violence, masked as polite dinner conversation. William Sr. would purportedly interrogate Billy about financial markets or horse breeding statistics, waiting for the boy to stumble, and then dismantle him with a withering, sarcastic remark that cut deeper than a whip. He treated Billy with a disdain that he would never dare show to his prize stallion, Gallant Fox. If a horse underperformed, it was a disappointment of genetics. If his son underperformed, it was a personal insult. This relentless erosion of Billy's self-worth created a vacuum in the young man's soul, a desperate need for validation that would eventually drive him into the arms of a woman who offered him the one thing his father never did: attention. The wealth William Sr. amassed became a weapon used against his own blood. He kept Billy on a financial leash, providing him with a lavish lifestyle, but denying him true independence. Billy lived in his father's houses, spent his father's money, and lived under his father's shadow. This was not generosity, it was control. By ensuring that Billy never had to work, William Sr. ensured that Billy never learned how to survive. He crippled his son with luxury. The irony here is bitter and sharp. The great man of industry, the genius of capital, failed at the most basic biological imperative of parenting. He built an empire to last 1,000 years, but failed to build a son capable of holding it for a single generation. Furthermore, William Sr.'s influence extended into the darkest corners of New York's political machine. Whispers in the smoking rooms of the Knickerbocker Club suggested that Woodward Sr. had the police and the judiciary in his pocket. He operated in an era where the law was a commodity to be purchased, just like cotton futures. If a Woodward got into trouble, the problem didn't go to court, it went away. This culture of impunity is essential to the tragedy. He taught his family that consequences were for poor people. He instilled in them the dangerous belief that the Woodward name was a magical incantation that could banish reality. When William Woodward Sr. died in 1953, the transition of power was less a passing of the torch and more the collapsing of a roof. He left behind a massive, labyrinthine estate and a void that Billy was utterly ill-equipped to fill. The godfather was gone, and the protection he provided vanished with him. The wolves, both social and actual, began to circle. But the most dangerous legacy he left was not the money or the bank. It was the psychological damage he had inflicted on his son. He had hollowed Billy out, turning him into a perfect shell, wealthy, handsome, and completely empty. He had created the perfect victim for a predator who knew exactly how to hunt weak men. The ghost of William Woodward Sr. haunts the narrative not as a specter of fear, but as a monument to the failure of patriarchal power. He proves that you can own the bank, you can own the horses, and you can own the politicians. But if you rot your family from the inside out with coldness and judgment, the gold will eventually turn into lead. He spent his life building a fortress to keep the world out, never realizing that he had locked his son in a cage with a monster, and he had thrown away the key long before the first shot was fired. If William Woodward Sr. was the hammer of the dynasty, his wife Elizabeth Elsie Ogden Kreider. Woodward was the scalpel, cold, precise, and capable of inflicting lethal wounds without ever raising her voice above a whisper. Elsie Woodward, the architect of exclusion, ruled the family with a frozen smile, guarding the Woodward bloodline like an immune system fighting a virus. The power Elsie wielded was distinct from the financial brute force of her husband. Her currency was social access. In the mid-20th century aristocracy, money was ubiquitous, but acceptance was scarce. Elsie guarded the gates of the Woodward bloodline with the vigilance of a biological immune system fighting off a virus. She possessed an innate radar for vulgarity, a term she applied liberally to anyone who chewed too loudly, laughed too freely, or, most damningly, came from nowhere. Her hostility toward the encroachment of the lower classes was palpable. She viewed the rise of new money not just as a social annoyance, but as a moral pollution, a rising tide of sewage threatening to stain the hem of her gown. This pathological elitism found its ultimate target in Ann Eden. When Billy Woodward brought Ann home, a showgirl from Kansas, with a fabricated past and the dust of the radio circuit still on her heels, Elsie did not see a daughter-in-law. She saw a pathogen. The conflict between these two women was not a simple domestic squabble, it was a collision of galaxies. Elsie represented the frozen, preserved air of the Gilded Age. Anne represented the chaotic, hungry heat of the post-war meritocracy. Whispers from the servants' quarters revealed the specific mechanics of Elsie's cruelty. Servants whispered that Elsie never actually spoke to Anne during the first year of the marriage. She spoke near her, or through her, addressing Billy as if the woman standing next to him were a piece of rented furniture. There are stories of dinner parties at the Oyster Bay estate where Elsie would rearrange the seating chart at the last minute to place Anne at the far end of the table, isolated in a Siberia of silence, surrounded by elderly aunts who looked at the former showgirl as if she were a zoo animal. This was psychological warfare conducted with silverware and place cards. Elsie's objective was to induce a state of permanent insecurity in Anne, to remind her with every glance that she was a trespasser who had snuck in through an unlocked window and could be thrown out by security at any moment. The revulsion Elsie felt for Anne was physical. It is said that Elsie would have the rooms aired out after Anne visited, as if the scent of Anne's desperation lingered on the upholstery. She scrutinized Anne's clothing, her accent, and her table manners with a microscopic intensity, waiting for the inevitable slip. When Anne tried to adapt, buying expensive clothes and mimicking the affectations of the elite, Elsie viewed it as a grotesque pantomime, a monkey dressing in human clothes. This rejection was systemic. Elsie ensured that Anne was blackballed from the most exclusive committees and clubs. She poisoned the water of New York society, whispering to her fellow matriarchs that Billy had been trapped by a gold digger. By closing these doors, Elsie forced Anne to cling even tighter to Billy, intensifying the suffocating pressure within the marriage. However, Elsie's role in the tragedy extends beyond mere snobbery. She was the financial enforcer. Knowing that Billy was weak and dependent on the family trust, Elsie used the purse strings as a choke collar. She kept the couple on a short leash. The rumors suggest that Elsie constantly threatened to cut Billy off if he didn't bring his wife to heel. This created a toxic triangle. Billy was terrified of his mother, Anne was terrified of losing the money, and Elsie sat at the apex, manipulating their fears. She infantilized her son well into his 30s, undermining his authority as a husband and a man. She wanted to prove that Anne loved the money, not the man, but in doing so, she ensured that the money became the only thing holding the marriage together. There is a dark, tragic irony in Elsie's machinations. She believed she was protecting the family legacy from a trashy invader. In reality, she was constructing the pressure cooker that would blow the family apart. Her relentless hostility fed Anne's paranoia. Anne's greatest fear was that Elsie would finally convince Billy to divorce her. Anne knew that in a divorce court presided over by Woodward lawyers and Woodward judges, she would be crushed. She would be sent back to Kansas with nothing. Every raised eyebrow from Elsie, every whispered critique sounded to Anne like a countdown clock. The queen was pushing the rat into a corner, unaware that a cornered rat eventually bites. Furthermore, Elsie's behavior reveals the moral rot at the core of the old money ethos. She cared more about the appearance of order than the reality of human suffering. She knew the marriage was a disaster. She knew Billy was miserable and drinking heavily. She knew Ann was unstable. Yet she refused to allow a divorce because Woodwards do not divorce. Scandal was the enemy. She preferred a miserable, hate-filled marriage behind closed doors to a messy public separation. She prioritized the sanctity of the family name over the safety of her own son. She locked them in the cage together, the predator and the prey, and stood guard outside to ensure the neighbors didn't hear the screaming. The relationship reached the breaking point in the months leading up to the shooting. Whispers suggest that Elsie had finally begun to sanction the idea of divorce, recognizing that Ann had become too volatile. She may have even begun moving assets to shield them from a potential settlement. This shift was the signal Ann had been dreading. The Queen was preparing the execution order. Elsie Woodward stands as a monument to the failure of aristocratic control. She spent a lifetime curating a world of perfect surfaces, believing that if she exerted enough pressure, she could force reality to bend to her will. She treated people like thoroughbreds, culling the weak and shunning the impure, but she failed to calculate the volatility of human desperation. She looked at Ann Woodward and saw a bug to be squashed. She didn't realize she was looking at a loaded gun. The blood that would soon soak the carpet of her son's home was in many ways on her hands. She had set the stage, directed the actors, and written the script of rejection that ended with a shotgun blast. The Queen sat on her throne, untouchable and cold, watching her empire burn, ignited by the very fire she had tried to stomp out. The union of William Billy Woodward Jr. and Ann Eden stands as one of the most chemically unstable experiments in the history of New York society, a collision between a man hollowed out by privilege and a woman sharpened by poverty. In the sterile, curated world of the social register, marriages were typically mergers, alliances of bloodlines designed to consolidate capital and secure territory. But the wedding of the Hanover heir to the radio actress from Kansas was not a merger. It was a hostile takeover. It was the moment the biological defenses of the old money elite finally failed, allowing a virus of raw, unchecked ambition to penetrate the inner sanctum. To the casual observer, they were the golden couple of the Eisenhower era, tall, beautiful, and obscenely wealthy. But behind the closed doors of their Oyster Bay estate, the dynamic was far more primal. It was the relationship between a wounded gazelle and a starving leopard, locked together in a cage of gold. William Woodward Jr., known to the world as Billy, was the tragic prototype of the American Dauphin. Born into a life of suffocating expectations, he was the prince of the dynasty. Yet he possessed none of the ruthless armor of his father or the cold steel of his mother. He was a man-child preserved in the amber of a trust fund. Tall, athletic, and devastatingly handsome, Billy appeared to be the perfect specimen of the master race his father was trying to breed. Yet internally, he was a vacuum. Years of psychological flaying by William Sr. and emotional strangulation by Elsie had left him without a spine. He drifted through life, a handsome ghost haunting the clubs of Manhattan, terrified of responsibility and desperate for a savior. He did not want a wife. He wanted a shield. He needed a woman who possessed the ferocity he lacked, someone who could stand between him and the terrifying judgment of his parents. Enter Angeline Lucille Crowell, the woman who would reinvent herself as Ann Eden. The trajectory of Ann Eden is a masterclass in the American art of self-fabrication. Born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, to a broken home and a life of dusty obscurity, Angeline was fueled by a radioactive isotope of shame. She looked at her surroundings, the divorce of her parents, the mediocrity of the Midwest, and felt a violent indignation. She believed she had been born into the wrong life by a clerical error of the universe. She fled to New York City not just to work, but to hunt. She scrubbed the Kansas accent from her voice, replaced her name with the elegant Ann Eden, and began her ascent through the tiers of Manhattan nightlife. She worked as a model, a radio actress, and a showgirl at the Fiafis Monte Carlo Club. She was not the most beautiful woman in New York, but she was the most dangerous. She possessed a radar for weakness, a predator's instinct that allowed her to spot a rich man with low self-esteem from across a crowded room. When Ann met Billy in 1943, she did not see a soulmate. She saw a target. She saw the Woodward name, the Bel Air stud, and the Hanover Bank. She saw the exit door from the life of a working girl. The rumor engine of the era has long speculated on the precise mechanics of the courtship. It was not a romance, it was a siege. Whispers in the cloakrooms of the Stork Club suggested that Ann studied Billy like a final exam. She learned his insecurities, his fear of his father, and his resentment of his mother. She positioned herself as the anti-Elsie. Where Elsie was cold and critical, Ann was warm and validating. Where his father was dismissive, Ann was attentive. She played the role of the adoring acolyte, feeding the starving ego of the prince until he was addicted to her praise. But there is a darker theory regarding why Billy, the most eligible bachelor in America, married a woman his mother considered trash. It suggests that Billy was engaged in a passive-aggressive rebellion. He knew that marrying a showgirl would horrify Elsie. He knew it would be a slap in the face to the old money code of purity. By bringing Ann into the family, he was planting a bomb in the living room of the parents who had tormented him. It was an act of self-destruction masked as love. He was using Ann as a weapon against his own bloodline, unaware that the weapon would eventually turn on him. The marriage, formalized in 1943, immediately began to rot. Once the ring was on her finger, the mask of the adoring Ann Eden began to slip, revealing the terrified, controlling Angeline Crowell beneath. Ann realized quickly that she had bought a lemon. Billy was not a king. He was a weak, alcoholic boy who wanted to play with his toys. The wealth was controlled by Elsie, and the social status was conditional. Ann found herself trapped in a hostile environment where every servant, every neighbor, and every relative viewed her as a usurper. This social rejection triggered a transformation in Ann. She became the social climber from hell. The disgust generated by her behavior stems from her desperate, clawing need for validation. She became more royalist than the king. She obsessed over the minutiae of etiquette, terrified of using the wrong fork or wearing the wrong shade of lipstick. She spent fortunes on clothes, trying to armor herself in Chanel and Dior, but the harder she tried, the more she smelled of effort. The aristocracy can forgive murder, but they cannot forgive effort. Sweat is the scent of the lower classes. The war between Billy and Ann devolved into a cycle of mutual abuse. Ann, realizing that Billy could not protect her from Elsie's scorn, turned her rage on him. She began to berate him in public, mocking his weakness, his lack of ambition, and his fear of his mother. Witnesses at dinner parties recounted scenes of excruciating humiliation, where Ann would snap at Billy like a dog trainer, correcting his stories or silencing him with a glare. She was trying to mold him into the powerful husband she needed him to be, but she only succeeded in breaking him further. Billy, in turn, retreated into the bottle. He began to have affairs, clumsy, obvious dalliances that were less about passion and more about escaping the suffocating intensity of his wife. He looked at Ann and saw the mistake he had made. He saw a woman who loved his bank account more than his soul. The schadenfreude of their misery is palpable. Two people who married for the wrong reasons, trapping each other in a golden cage. Ann had the money she wanted but was miserable. Billy had the rebellion he wanted but was enslaved. The rumor engine churned with stories of the violence behind the closed doors of the Oyster Bay mansion. Maids whispered of screaming matches that lasted until dawn, of flying crystal ashtrays, and of Ann pacing the hallways like a caged tiger. There were rumors that Ann had begun to suffer from a profound paranoia, convinced that Billy was conspiring with Elsie to divorce her and throw her back into the gutter. This fear was the engine of her madness. To Ann, divorce was not just a breakup, it was a death sentence. It meant returning to Kansas. It meant admitting that Angeline Crowell had failed. By 1955, the marriage was a corpse walking. Billy was reportedly making moves to legally separate, emboldened by Elsie's support. He had finally decided to cut the cancer out, but he underestimated the survival instinct of the organism he was trying to kill. Ann Woodward was not a woman who would go quietly into the night. She was a fighter who had clawed her way up from nothing, and she would burn the house down before she let them take the keys away. The prince had invited a predator into his bed, thinking he could tame her with diamonds. He failed to realize that a predator is never truly tamed. It simply waits for the moment when the keeper forgets to lock the cage. The toxic chemistry of their union had reached its boiling point, and the explosion was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability waiting for a spark. If Elsie was the judge, then the jury was the Swans, that legendary circle of high society matriarchs led by Babe Paley, Slim Keith, and CZ Guest. Ann Woodward didn't just want their money, she wanted their validation. She desperately tried to mimic their glacial perfection, copying their hairstyles, their mannerisms, and their parties. But to the Swans, Ann was nothing more than a cheap imitation in expensive clothes. They viewed her with the detached amusement of scientists watching a lab rat trying to escape a maze. The rejection was systematic and brutal. When Ann entered a room, conversations would stop, replaced by a silence sharper than a knife. They mocked her radio actress past, whispering that she still smelled of cheap makeup and desperation. Slim Keith, known for her razor-sharp wit, reportedly dismissed Ann as a creature of effort in a world where effort was the ultimate sin. This exclusion was not just social, it was psychological warfare. By refusing to let her into the inner circle, the Swans confirmed Ann's deepest insecurity, that no matter how many diamonds Billy bought her, she would always be the girl from Kansas. This isolation fueled her paranoia, convincing her that the entire world, led by these women, was conspiring to destroy her, pushing her closer to the edge of violence. Teetering on that edge, the timeline tightened rapidly. The sprawling estate at Oyster Bay, usually a sanctuary of manicured silence and equestrian glory, had transformed into a psychological pressure cooker. The air inside the mansion was heavy with the static electricity of a coming storm. To the outside world, Ann Woodward was still the glamorous, if slightly frantic, society hostess. But inside the walls of the master suite, she was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the abyss of total social annihilation. The true motive was likely far more calculated. Ann was not losing her mind. She was losing her grip on the assets. Her madness was not biological. It was situational. It was the specific, terrifying clarity of a parasite realizing the host is about to die. The catalyst for this descent was the terrifying, concrete reality of divorce. The rumor engine of the North Shore had shifted from idle gossip to near certainty. Billy Woodward was finally ready to pull the trigger on the marriage. Emboldened by his mother Elsie and exhausted by a decade of screaming matches, Billy had reportedly consulted lawyers. He was looking for an exit strategy. For Ann, this was not heartbreak. It was an existential threat. Divorce meant the stripping of her title, the loss of the Bel Air stud, and a one-way ticket back to the dusty anonymity of Pittsburgh, Kansas. It meant that Angeline Crowell had failed. The fear of this social death was far more potent than the fear of physical violence. She looked at her husband and saw a man who was about to steal her life. In this climate of paranoia, a convenient narrative began to take shape, a narrative that would provide the perfect cover for a lethal solution. The neighborhood of Oyster Bay was allegedly gripped by a prowler scare. There were reports of a burglar roaming the wealthy estates of the Gold Coast. Whether this threat was genuine or exaggerated is irrelevant. What matters is how Ann Woodward weaponized it. She latched onto the idea of the prowler with a fanatical intensity. It became her obsession, her script, and ultimately, her alibi. Witnesses and servants later described a woman who was performing the role of the terrified wife with a little too much enthusiasm. She began to speak incessantly about the danger. She demanded that the house be secured like a fortress. But there is a disgusting contradiction in her behavior. A genuinely terrified woman might hire extra security guards or install better locks. Anne did not do that. Instead, she armed herself. She insisted on keeping weapons in the bedroom. She turned the domestic space into a kill zone. The logic is chilling. If you are afraid of a burglar, you call the police. If you are planning to shoot your husband and blame it on a burglar, you buy a shotgun. The weapon in question was not a delicate pearl-handled pistol suitable for a lady's nightstand. It was a custom-made double-barreled shotgun, a weapon designed to stop a charging boar or blast a pheasant out of the sky. The sheer brutality of bringing such a weapon into a domestic setting speaks to the violence simmering beneath Anne's surface. She was not preparing for defense. She was preparing for annihilation. The tension reached its breaking point on the night of October 30th, 1955. The evening began with a masterclass in social hypocrisy, a dinner party honoring the Duchess of Windsor, Wallis Simpson. This event was the Super Bowl of high society. For Anne, it should have been a triumph. She was dining with royalty, the very peak of the mountain she had climbed. But observers at the party noted a manic, brittle energy in her demeanor. She was drinking heavily. Her laughter was too loud, her eyes too wide. She was vibrating with a frequency that made the other guests uncomfortable. She was a woman wearing a mask that was slipping. The war between Billy and Anne at the party was toxic. They sniped at each other, their hatred leaking out in sharp, jagged comments, masked as banter. Billy, tired and drunk, looked like a man walking to the gallows. Anne looked like the executioner growing impatient. The schadenfreude of the scene is dark and heavy. Here were the envied elite, draped in diamonds and tuxedos, eating the finest food, yet trapped in a hell of their own making. The party was a funeral wake for their marriage, but only one of them knew the coffin was already ordered. They returned to the Oyster Bay estate around 1 a.m. The house was dark. The servants had retired to their quarters in a separate wing. The stage was set. Upon entering the house, the couple made a decision that would become the pivot point of the investigation. They went to separate bedrooms. This was not unusual for the aristocracy, but on this night, it was a tactical maneuver. They were separated by a hallway, a no man's land of carpet and shadows. The behavior of Ann Woodward in the hour that followed defies the logic of an innocent panic. According to her later testimony, she was terrified by the sound of the wind, by the creaking of the house. She claimed the prowler fear had seized her. Yet she did not wake the servants. She did not lock her door and hide under the covers. She did not call the local police station to report suspicious noises. Instead, she picked up the shotgun. Imagine the visceral, shocking image. A socialite in a sheer blue negligee prowling the dark corridors of her mansion, clutching a loaded shotgun. She was hunting. She moved through the darkness not as prey, but as a predator. The prowler, in her mind, had become the perfect avatar for her rage. Every creak of the floorboard was a justification. Every shadow was an enemy. But the true enemy wasn't a burglar climbing in the window. It was the man sleeping in the room across the hall. The man who held the keys to the bank vault. The man who wanted to leave her. The rumor engine has generated a persistent, darker theory about this interval between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. It suggests that Ann was not merely reacting to noises. She was waiting for Billy to wake up, waiting for a movement, waiting for the silence to be broken so she could break it further. Did she pace the hall to work up the nerve? Did she stand outside his door, finger on the trigger, rehearsing the scream she would release after the shot? The line between paranoid delusion and cold-blooded calculation vanishes in that hallway. There is a theory that Paul Worths, the actual neighborhood nuisance who would later be arrested, was indeed nearby that night. But Ann likely never saw him. She didn't need to see him. She only needed the idea of him. The concept of the intruder gave her license to kill. It turned a murder into an accident. It turned a wife into a victim. The unhinged moment of bang bang Ann Woodward. As the clock ticked toward 2 a.m., the house settled into a heavy silence. The dog, a poodle named Sloppy, reportedly barked. Or perhaps it didn't. Perhaps the only sound was the thumping of Ann's heart as she gripped the cold steel of the barrel. She was standing on the precipice of history. One pull of the trigger would solve the divorce problem. One pull would silence the mother-in-law. One pull would secure the fortune. The paranoia had done its work. It had stripped away her morality and left only the survival instinct of the cornered animal. The showgirl from Kansas was about to perform her final, most deadly act. The curtain was up, the lights were out, and the gun was loaded. At exactly 2 a.m., that gun went off. The hallway outside William Woodward Jr.'s bedroom became the 0 point of an explosion that would splatter the family reputation across the front pages of every newspaper in the Western world. Until this moment, the violence in the Woodward marriage had been psychological. Screams, whispers, shattered glass. Now it was kinetic. The tension that had been pressurized by Elsie's judgment and Ann's paranoia finally found its release valve in the twin barrels of a custom-made shotgun. The physics of the event are grotesque in their simplicity. William Billy Woodward Jr. stepped out of his bedroom door. He was naked, or perhaps wearing flimsy pajamas, defenseless and groggy, likely awakened by the sound of his wife pacing or the dog barking. He was not an intruder. He was not a shadow. He was the master of the house, moving through his own domain. Standing less than 10 feet away in the gloom of the corridor was Ann Woodward. She did not call out a challenge. She did not ask, "Who is there?" She did not fumble for the light switch to illuminate the face of the prowler she claimed to fear. She raised the weapon. She pulled the trigger. The sound of a 12-gauge shotgun discharging in a confined indoor space is not a bang. It is a concussion. It is a deafening, chest-compressing roar that sucks the air out of the room. But the sound was secondary to the devastation of the impact. The forensic reality of the wound was horrifyingly absolute. This was not a clean, cinematic death. The shot did not strike Billy in the chest or the shoulder. The cluster of lead pellets struck him directly in the face. The description of the trauma is necessary to dismantle the romanticized notion of a tragic accident. The blast obliterated the identity of William Woodward Jr., the face that had been photographed at the Stork Club, the handsome, weak jawline that resembled his father's, the eyes that had looked so fearfully at his mother. All of it was erased in a fraction of a second. The impact turned the head of the millionaire heir into a red mist. The pellets tore through bone, cartilage, and brain matter, exiting the back of the skull and embedding themselves in the expensive wainscoting of the hallway. Billy did not die instantly in the sense of a peaceful cessation of life. He was biologically deactivated, his body propelled backward by the kinetic energy of the blast, crumpled onto the thick imported carpet. The silence that followed the roar was heavy, broken only by the settling of dust and the dripping of blood. The scene that awaited the first responders was a tableau of disgust that defied the opulent setting. The Oyster Bay Mansion was a temple of old money aesthetics. Silk wallpapers, antique furniture, the smell of beeswax and potpourri. Now it was an abattoir. The blood of the Hanover banking fortune soaked into the fibers of the rug, expanding in a dark, sticky pool that crept toward the baseboards. Brain matter and bone fragments were scattered across the walls like grotesque confetti. The contrast was nauseating, the sheer brutality of a battlefield execution taking place in a hallway designed for polite society. Ann Woodward stood amidst this carnage. Her behavior in the immediate aftermath serves as the primary fuel for the rumor engine. According to the official police reports, she was hysterical, screaming, "I shot him. I thought he was a prowler." She threw herself over the body, staining her blue negligee with her husband's blood. But whispers from the first officers on the scene paint a different, more chilling picture. Some accounts suggest that in the seconds before the screaming started, there was a cold, calculating silence. A delay. A pause just long enough to verify the kill. Did she stand over the ruined body of the prince, looking down at her handiwork with a sense of grim satisfaction? The schadenfreude here is dark and complex. The showgirl had finally won. She had eliminated the threat of divorce. She had stopped the prince from leaving her. In that hallway, covered in blood, she was the most powerful person in the Woodward dynasty. She held the smoking gun, and the man who wanted to cast her aside was reduced to a heap of meat on the floor. When the Nassau County Police arrived, they walked into a scene that had already been contaminated by the chaos of wealth. The servants were weeping. The family doctor was summoned before the medical examiner, a classic maneuver of the elite to control the narrative. But the cops, hardened men who had seen domestic violence in the tenements, smelled a rat. They looked at the body, they looked at the gun, they looked at Ann. The forensic anomalies were glaring. The angle of the shot suggested Billy was standing upright, facing her. If he was a prowler, why didn't he duck? Why didn't he shout? If she was terrified, why didn't she fire a warning shot? Why aim for the head? The precision of the violence suggested rage, not panic. You shoot a prowler to stop him. You shoot a husband in the face to erase him. Furthermore, the condition of the room sparked intense indignation among the investigators. The police were treated not as authority figures, but as intruders. The Woodward family lawyers arrived with terrifying speed, erecting a wall of silence around Ann. She was sedated, shielded, and moved to a hospital before she could be properly interrogated. In a poor neighborhood, Ann would have been handcuffed, dragged to a cell, and charged with manslaughter by sunrise. In Oyster Bay, she was treated as the victim. The blue wall of silence protected her. The blood was still wet on the floor, and the cover-up had already begun. The rumor engine also churned with the story of the second shot. The shotgun was a double-barreled weapon. Ann fired both barrels. One hit Billy, the other went wide, striking the wall. The defense claimed this proved her panic. She was just blasting away in the dark. But forensic skeptics have argued a darker theory. The second shot was the alibi shot, a calculated miss to sell the story of uncontrollable fear. A single shot to the head looks like an execution. 2 shots, one wild, looks like a terrified woman defending her home. As Billy's body was zipped into a bag and wheeled out of the mansion he had inherited but never truly ruled, the transformation of the house was complete. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. The smell of cordite and copper lingered in the air, overpowering the scent of fresh flowers. The red room, the bloody hallway, became a stain on the family history that no amount of money could scrub away. The death of Billy Woodward was not a tragedy. It was a biological necessity of the toxic system they had built. The predator, Ann, had devoured the prey, Billy. The strong had culled the weak. The violence was the physical manifestation of the hatred that had festered in the marriage for a decade. Ann Woodward had solved her problems with a 12-gauge solution. She was now the widow Woodward. She had kept the name. She had kept the house. She had kept the money. All it cost was the face of the man she had promised to love and cherish. Yet, despite the carnage, the law decided to look the other way. The official legal verdict regarding the death of William Woodward Jr. is accidental shooting, a sanitized, polite conclusion stamped by a grand jury that was deferential to the Woodward name and orchestrated by the most expensive lawyers in New York. However, the forensic files and the persistent rumor engine of the era scream a different, far darker truth. The accident theory relies on the premise that Ann Woodward was a hysterical, terrified woman acting on instinct. But a deeper analysis of the timeline, the motive, and the mechanics of the event suggests a chilling alternative. The shooting was not a tragedy of errors. It was a masterpiece of opportunistic execution. It was a 2 birds with 1 stone scenario, where Ann utilized a neighborhood panic to solve her impending divorce problem with a single trigger pull. This hypothesis begins with the motive, which fuels our indignation. In October 1955, Ann Woodward was facing a financial and social death sentence. The divorce was no longer a threat, it was an itinerary. Billy was preparing to leave her. Under the strict laws of the time and the prenuptial protections of the Woodward Trust, a divorced Ann would be cast out of the kingdom. She would lose the Oyster Bay estate, the Bel Air stud, the access to the bank accounts, and the title of Mrs. Woodward. She would be returned to the status of Angeline Crowell, the aging showgirl from Kansas, tainted by scandal and stripped of her armor. But a widow retains everything. A widow keeps the name. A widow inherits the trust fund. A widow garners sympathy rather than scorn. The cold calculus of survival dictated that Billy was worth infinitely more to her dead than alive. Alive, he was a liability who was about to fire her. Dead, he was a saint whose memory would secure her financial future. Enter Paul Worths, the prowler. The existence of Paul Worths is the linchpin of the dark hypothesis. Worths was a real person, a petty criminal who had indeed been burglarizing homes in the area. He was later arrested and confessed to being near the Woodward estate on the night of the shooting. For the defense, Worths was a gift from God, the tangible proof of Ann's fear. But for the cynical investigator, Worths was not the cause of the shooting. He was the excuse. The rumor engine suggests that Ann did not need to see Worths to use him. She simply needed the narrative of him. The neighborhood gossip about a burglar provided the perfect stage directions for her performance. She stoked the fear in the days leading up to the murder, ensuring that everyone, The servants, the friends, Billy, knew she was terrified. She was laying the psychological groundwork for an alibi. By establishing a baseline of hysteria, she ensured that any violence she committed would be viewed through the lens of panic rather than malice. The mechanics of the shooting itself dismantle the panic defense and evoke a profound sense of disgust at the calculation involved. Consider the lighting. The hallway was dark. If Anne were truly afraid of a stranger roaming her house, the human instinct is to flood the zone with light, to flip switches, to see the threat. Darkness favors the ambusher, not the defender. By keeping the hallway dark, Anne created the perfect kill zone. The darkness allowed her to claim "I didn't see who it was," while simultaneously hiding her own intent. It gave her plausible deniability. She didn't shoot Billy, she shot a shadow. Furthermore, the silence is damning. A terrified homeowner screams. They shout, "Get out," or "I have a gun." They call for help. Anne did none of these things. She moved with the silent lethality of a hunter stalking prey. She waited in the gloom, weapon raised, knowing that the door across the hall would eventually open. When Billy stepped out, she did not hesitate. There was no warning shot. There was no hesitation to verify the target. She fired directly at the head. This is not defensive shooting. This is an assassination. The aim was not to neutralize a threat. The aim was to ensure that the target could never speak again. The cynicism of the two birds theory lies in its exploitation of class dynamics. Ann Woodward used the specter of a poor criminal, Worth's, to cover up a rich murder. She knew that the police and the public were primed to believe that a scary, lower-class intruder was the villain. She weaponized the class prejudices of her neighbors against them. She banked on the fact that the authorities would rather believe in a tragic mistake caused by a burglar than accept that a wealthy socialite had executed her husband in cold blood. The schadenfreude of this hypothesis is bitter. Anne thought she'd committed the perfect crime. She had saved her fortune. She had eliminated the husband who wanted to discard her. She had the perfect alibi in the form of the prowler. Technically, she won. The grand jury refused to indict her. She walked free, but the victory was a poisoned chalice. While she escaped the electric chair, she stepped into a different kind of prison. The dark hypothesis was not just a theory held by the police. It was the silent verdict of all New York society. Everyone knew. The servants knew she didn't call out. The neighbors knew she was losing her marriage. Elsie Woodward knew her son was trying to escape. By using the prowler story, Anne insulted the intelligence of the very people she was trying to impress. She saved her bank account, but she destroyed her life. She became a pariah, a woman who walked into a room and caused the temperature to drop 20 degrees. The most chilling aspect of this scenario is the silence of Billy Woodward. In this version of events, he is the ultimate victim of betrayal. He walked out of his room, perhaps to comfort his wife, perhaps to check on the dog, only to find that the woman he had lifted out of poverty was waiting for him with a 12-gauge negation of their vows. He died because he was inconvenient. He was liquidated like a bad asset. The most terrifying aspect of the aftermath was not the police investigation, but the silent transaction between the two Mrs. Woodwards. Elsie Woodward, the matriarch, was not a fool. She likely knew with the instinct of a mother that her daughter-in-law had executed her son, but Elsie was a Woodward first and a mother second. She understood that a murder trial would drag the family name through the gutter, exposing the bank and their private lives to the vulgar public. The Hanover Bank could not afford a murderess. So Elsie made the coldest calculation of her life. She paid for the best defense lawyers money could buy to protect the woman who killed her son. She used her immense influence to ensure the accident verdict was sealed. But this was not mercy. It was a life sentence. In exchange for her freedom, Ann was effectively banished. Elsie ensured that Ann kept the money and the name, but she stripped her of her soul. Ann was forced to live as a pariah, shunned by the very society Elsie ruled. It was a devil's bargain. Elsie bought the silence to save the dynasty, and in return, she watched from her throne as Ann Woodward slowly rotted away in a prison of isolation, knowing that the check for her freedom had been signed by the mother of her victim. The legal system of the United States, blinded by the glare of the Hanover fortune and the influence of Elsie Woodward, failed to convict Ann Woodward of murder, but justice, twisted and delayed, eventually found a different delivery mechanism. It did not arrive in the form of a judge in a black robe, but in the form of a diminutive, high-pitched writer holding a martini glass. Truman Capote was the executioner Ann Woodward never saw coming. The relationship between the widow of Oyster Bay and the genius of American letters stands as one of the most grotesque examples of parasitic friendship in the 20th century. Anne believed she had found a confidant, a man who understood the cruelty of high society, because he, too, was an outsider looking in. She did not realize she was sitting down for tea with a viper who was measuring her neck for a noose made of typewriter ribbon. The war between Capote and Anne was fueled by a mutual desperate narcissism. In the years following the shooting, Anne lived in a state of social quarantine. She was wealthy, she was free, but she was radioactive. The polite society of New York tolerated her presence only because they feared her mother-in-law Elsie. But Truman Capote had no such inhibitions. He was drawn to the scent of rot. He cultivated a friendship with Anne, listening to her endless defenses, her paranoid justifications, and her drunken ramblings about the accident. To Anne, Truman was a sympathetic ear. To Truman, Anne was simply raw material. He was harvesting her. He looked at her tragic life and saw the centerpiece for his magnum opus, Answered Prayers, a novel intended to be the American equivalent of Proust, dissecting the corruption of the very rich. The rumor engine of the literary world buzzed with anticipation as Capote bragged about his upcoming work. He referred to Anne privately, and then increasingly publicly, as Mrs. Bang Bang. The nickname was a masterstroke of cruelty, stripping Anne of her dignity and reducing her entire existence to a punchline. It revealed the sheer disgust Capote felt for her. He did not view her as a grieving widow. He viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who had gotten away with it. And he decided that if the courts wouldn't punish her, he would. The weapon of choice was a chapter titled La Côte Basque, 1965, scheduled for publication in Esquire magazine in November 1975. The text of La Côte Basque was a thinly veiled roman à clef that functioned as a literary assassination. In the story, a character clearly modeled on Ann Woodward is depicted not as a victim of circumstance, but as a sociopathic opportunist. Capote rewrote the events of 1955 with a terrifying forensic clarity. He dismantled the prowler defense piece by piece. In his version, the wife waits for the husband to come home, knowing he is planning to leave her. She stages the scene. She waits in the dark. And then, in a phrase that became legendary for its malice, Capote wrote that she shot him affectionately through the head. The phrase, shot him affectionately, drips with malice and cruel irony. It implies that the murder was the ultimate act of possession. She killed him because she loved the status he provided more than the man himself. She loved him to death. When the advance copies of Esquire began to circulate in New York in October 1975, the reaction was nuclear. The Swans, Capote's circle of high society women, were horrified. not because they sympathized with Ann, but because Capote had violated the omerta of their class. He had put the secrets in print. But for Ann Woodward, the impact was terminal. The publication meant the end of her fragile social quarantine. She was no longer just the woman rumored to have killed her husband. She was now the confirmed villain of a national bestseller. The article validated every whisper, every side-eye, every snub she had endured for 20 years. It stripped her naked in the town square. The mental collapse of Ann Woodward in those final days of October 1975 was rapid and absolute. She was 60 years old, her beauty fading, her sons distant, and her reputation about to be incinerated. She knew that once the magazine hit the newsstands, the staring would stop being polite. The silence would turn into shouting. She faced a future of total isolation, pursued by the mocking laughter of Truman Capote. On the night of October 10th, 1975, just days before the magazine's official release, Ann Woodward made her final move. She did not call a lawyer to sue for libel. She did not call a friend for comfort. She retreated to her apartment on Fifth Avenue, a fortress of loneliness purchased with blood money, and prepared a cocktail that would solve her problems just as permanently as the shotgun had 20 years earlier. The agent of her departure was cyanide. The presence of cyanide in her possession is a detail that evokes a profound chill. Cyanide is not a common household poison. It is a tool of spies and captured soldiers, a break glass in case of emergency exit strategy. Its existence suggests that Ann had been living with the possibility of self-destruction for years. She had kept the pill like a talisman, knowing that one day the walls would close in. The physiological reality of cyanide poisoning provides a grim counterpoint to the glamour of her life. It causes histotoxic hypoxia, a violent, suffocating shutdown of the body's ability to process oxygen. It is not a gentle drifting away. It is a biological seizure. Ann Woodward died alone, convulsing in her luxury apartment, killed by the same toxic need for control that had led her to the hallway in Oyster Bay. She killed herself to rob Truman Capote of his satisfaction. It was a preemptive strike. By dying before the public could read the story, she reclaimed the narrative for one final moment. She delivered the ultimate no comment. However, the schadenfreude of the situation is double-edged. Ann's suicide was interpreted by the world not as a tragedy, but as a confession. Innocent people fight back, guilty people swallow poison. By killing herself, she effectively signed the confession she had refused to sign in 1955. The cyanide verdict was unanimous, guilty. But the Woodward tragedy did not end with Ann. The curse, which is merely a romantic name for the radioactive fallout of trauma and neglect, continued to burn through the bloodline. The true victims of this war were the children, William Woody Woodward III and James Jimmy Woodward. These two boys had slept down the hall while their mother blew their father's face off. They were raised by the steel butterfly, Elsie, and the black widow, Ann, in a house built on lies. The fate of the sons is the source of the deepest indignation in this dossier. They never stood a chance. Jimmy Woodward, the younger son, succumbed to schizophrenia and a life of psychiatric institutionalization, his mind shattered by the unspoken horrors of his childhood. He jumped from a window in 1976, just a year after his mother's suicide, though he survived the fall physically broken. The elder son, Woody, seemed to have escaped. He was handsome, wealthy, and seemingly well-adjusted. He tried to live the life his father failed to live, but the poison was in the DNA. In 1999, 44 years after the shotgun blast, Woody Woodward checked into the Essex House Hotel in Manhattan and threw himself out of the window. His suicide was the final punctuation mark on the family sentence. The Woodward dynasty, which had once controlled the Hanover Bank and the Bel Air Stud, effectively ceased to exist. The money remained, but the life was gone. The estate in Oyster Bay, the racing trophies, the society pages, it all ended in a pile of broken bodies on the pavement and a corpse filled with cyanide. The final verdict on the Woodward family is a damning indictment of the American dream in its most corrupted form. They proved that you can buy the law, you can buy silence, and you can buy entry into the most exclusive rooms on earth, but you cannot buy an escape from the truth. William Woodward Sr. built a bank to hoard gold, but he bankrupted his family's soul. Ann Woodward shot her way to security, but found only a prison. And Truman Capote, the jester who told the truth, watched it all burn with a martini in his hand, until the flames eventually consumed him too. The house is empty now, the horses are gone, and all that remains is the echo of a shotgun blast in a dark hallway, a sound that has taken 70 years to finally fade away.